Gene Clark's final moment in the spotlight was as bittersweet as the songs he used to sing. In January 1991, he stepped on stage beside his long-estranged bandmates from the Byrds at their Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction. The once golden boy of 60s folk rock was now 46, his tall frame a bit heavier, his voice a bit frayed. Still, when they launched into one of his old songs, I'll Feel a Whole Lot Better, Clark delivered it with panache, and even something of a smile. The audience saw a veteran getting his due. What they couldn't see was that Clark was gravely ill, battling decades of alcohol abuse and a recent cancer diagnosis. Just a few months later, he would be gone, dead from a bleeding ulcer in a modest Los Angeles home, far from the screaming fans and hit records of his youth. It was a lonely end to a life that had once burned blindingly bright. How did a founding member of one of the biggest American bands, a man Bob Dylan called one of the greatest songwriters of his time, end up living and dying in their shadows? It's a story of sky-high talent, crippling fears, whirlwind romances, and the self-destructive demons he could never quite outrun. Welcome to Rock and Roll Mysteries. Gene Clark was born Harold Eugene Clark on November the 17th, 1944 in Tipton, Missouri. He grew up the third of 13 children in a poor but tight-knit family of Irish, German, and Native American heritage. From an early age, music was his thing. His father taught him guitar and harmonica in their Kansas City home, and Gene proved a natural. By age 11, he was not only strumming Hank Williams tunes and harmonizing to Elvis records, but already writing simple songs of his own. Singing came just as effortlessly. With a rich, soulful tenor voice that could soar over any melody, young Gene found that music gave him an identity beyond the crowded Clark household. And that drive to stand out would propel him through every door that opened. Yet even in those carefree Midwestern boyhood days, a dark premonition crept into Gene's psyche, one that would haunt him for life. As a child, he witnessed a horrifying plane crash near his home, watching as metal and flames fell from the sky. The trauma seemed to scar his inner mind. He developed a deep-seated fear of flying that he tried to bury, but it never truly went away. For now, though, that fear was merely theoretical. Not many poor kids in the 50s were flying about on planes. But the teenager who taught himself rock and roll licks in the family garage couldn't have imagined how it would later derail him. In high school, Gene formed a series of little rock combos, the Sharks, the Rum Runners, the Surf Riders among them. He started singing at local sock hops and VFW halls. He was beginning to chase down a dream of music stardom that must have seemed impossibly distant in small-town Missouri. That dream found him sooner than he expected. In August 1963, at just 18, Gene got a lucky break. While performing with the Surf Riders at a Kansas City lounge, he caught the eye of touring musicians from the New Christy Minstrels, a popular commercial folk troupe. Impressed by the boy's voice and presence, they offered him a place in the group on the spot. Suddenly, Gene was whisked out of Kansas and into the professional music world. He spent the next year touring and recording with the Minstrels, learning the ropes of show business as the clean-cut folk revival rolled on. It was steady work, and it put 2 albums under his belt before age 20, but Gene felt a restlessness. In early 1964, the seismic shock of the Beatles hit America, and Clark, like so many other young musicians, had an epiphany. Folk music was lovely, but rock and roll was where the real excitement and girls and money were. One night that year at the Troubadour Club in Los Angeles, Gene's path changed forever. He saw a shaggy-haired folk singer named Jim McGuinn, later Roger McGuinn, performing Beatles covers on an acoustic guitar. Legend has it that Gene jumped on stage to harmonize on a Beatles tune, and by the end of the song, the 2 young men knew they had the makings of something special. With McGuinn's jangling 12-string guitar and reedy lead vocals, and Clark's clear tenor and songwriting ability, they began assembling a band that would mash together folk and rock in a new way. By early 1965, that band, the Byrds, had coalesced and Gene Clark was at its heart. He wasn't the ostensible leader. McGuinn would be pushed forward as the frontman by management, but within the group, Gene was the creative dynamo. In the Byrds' electrifying take on Bob Dylan's Mr. Tambourine Man, it's Gene's voice you hear delivering those famous "To Dance Beneath the Diamond Skylines" in sparkling harmony. On stage, the tall, dark-haired Clark often commanded center stage with a tambourine in hand, his face framed by a cool mod haircut. Decades later, bassist Chris Hillman remembered how Gene could electrify a crowd from the first moments of a show. Gene would burst through the stage curtain banging on a tambourine, coming on like a young Prince Valiant, a hero, our saviour. Few in the audience could take their eyes off this presence. With his angular cheekbones, perfectly mussed hair and haunted, mournful eyes, Clark looked every inch the sensitive rock star. He had the teen magazines dubbing him the handsomest bird, and girls would shriek when he sang. More importantly, he had the gift, as Hillman said, an uncanny knack for songwriting that set him apart. In the Byrds' first 2 albums alone, Clark wrote or co-wrote most of their best-known originals. Gems like "I'll Feel a Whole Lot Better," "Here Without You," "She Don't Care About Time," and the poetic "Set You Free This Time." The band's manager even noticed that Clark was writing so many hits, he was making far more money than the others from songwriting royalties, a fact that quietly sowed envy among his bandmates. For a spell in 1965, Gene Clark rode the crest of the folk rock wave he'd helped create. The Byrds' chiming cover of Mr. Tambourine Man was a #1 hit, and the group was called America's answer to the Beatles. Clark was only 20 years old, tasting the spoils of fame: money, new cars, screaming fans, nights on the Sunset Strip. He also found himself entangled in the kind of romantic intrigue that made fodder for tabloids. In mid-1966, at the height of the Byrds' fame, Gene began a secret affair with Michelle Phillips, the beautiful blonde singer from the Mamas and the Papas. Michelle was married to her bandmate John Phillips, so the fling had to be kept quiet. For a time it was, until Michelle started blowing kisses at Gene while on stage, right in front of John. The fallout was instant and dramatic. John kicked Michelle out of the Mamas and the Papas upon learning she'd been with Gene and replaced her with Jill Gibson. He even went in for a bit of Stalin-style historical revisionism, having Jill's photo cut out, pasted over Michelle in one band shot. After a couple of months, Michelle was forgiven and reinstated, but the scandal was not easily forgotten. Clark, still barely in his 20s, had inadvertently ignited a mini-rock soap opera. It wouldn't be the last time his love life got messy. Shortly after the Michelle episode, Gene fell into a passionate fling with a young Hollywood actress named Terry Messina. Terry was wild, and for 6 months in 1966, they burned through a West Coast romance fueled by late-night parties and Clark's newfound celebrity status. But even the thrill of new love couldn't settle Gene's growing unease. As his star rose, so did the pressures of fame, and the anxiety that had lurked in him since childhood was now rearing its head in a dangerous way. The Byrds were touring constantly in 1965 to 66, jetting across America and beyond to capitalize on their hit records. For Gene, every airport check-in and turbulent flight became a waking nightmare. The same man who co-wrote the psychedelic Flight of Fancy, 8 Miles High, was privately terrified each time he had to board a plane. At first, he managed to cope, often by downing stiff drinks before takeoff, or chemically enhancing himself, as David Crosby put it, to get through the jitters. But in late February 1966, on a flight bound for New York, Clark's nerve gave out. As the other Byrds settled into their seats, Gene was overwhelmed by a full-blown panic attack. Convinced the plane was about to crash, he stood up pale and shaking and demanded to be let off. His bandmates watched in astonishment as Gene Clark, the group's hit songwriter and resident heartthrob, walked off the aircraft, refusing to fly. In the end, the Byrds took off without their co-founder, and Gene, after 2 years of mounting tension, quit the Byrds altogether in early 1966. It was a stunning decision. Clark abandoned one of the world's most popular bands just as they were soaring to new heights, so to speak. Indeed, within weeks, the Byrds would score another smash with 8 Miles High. The official reasons for his departure were a tangled mix. The fear of flying was the final straw, but there were other wounds festering. Jealousy from McGuinn and Crosby over Gene's royalty income and spotlight, personality clashes, and Gene's own fragile mental health under the spotlight. At one time, he was the power in the Byrds, not McGuinn, not Crosby, Chris Hillman reflected, implying that the others perhaps felt threatened. In any case, by March 1966, Gene was back home in Kansas, licking his wounds. He spent a disheartening spell with his family, feeling, as one friend put it, hurt that the other members hadn't tried to persuade him not to leave. The young man who had stood in the Hollywood spotlight now found himself trudging around his Missouri hometown as an ex-pop star, a prodigal son with a broken wing. He wondered if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. Just a little reminder before I go on that I have a Patreon page up and running if you want to support the channel. And over there, you will get a weekly extra mini episode of about 10 to 15 minutes on some part of rock history. I've got pieces on Jan Wenner, founder of Rolling Stone, the tragic day the Mercer Center collapsed, and the history of CBGB, among others. Have a look at the tiers. I'll link it on screen now. There are plenty of other benefits on offer, and the support is hugely appreciated. Cheers. Right, on with the show. As it turned out, Columbia Records, the Byrds label, wasn't about to throw away Gene's talent. They quickly signed him as a solo artist, banking on the Byrds hitmaker to churn out more chart toppers on his own. In early 1967, barely a year after leaving the band, Clark released his debut solo album, Gene Clark, with the Gosdin brothers. He was still only 22 and brimming with songwriting ideas. The album was a mix of California country twang with baroque psychedelic pop, an experimental sound that was just ahead of its time. Critics were intrigued, and the few listeners who heard it loved its sense of adventure. But the timing was cruel. Just as Clark's album hit shelves, the Byrds' sons Gene put out their own new record, Younger Than Yesterday, which massively overshadowed Gene's work in sales. Radio stuck with the familiar Byrds brand, and Clark's solo venture tanked commercially. To make matters worse, as 1967 wore on, Gene realized how much he missed the camaraderie, however imperfect, of his old band. That autumn, with Byrds members squabbling, David Crosby had been ousted in a blaze of ego and acrimony, Gene Clark humbled himself and agreed to rejoin the Byrds. For a brief flicker of time, it looked like a second chance. The original Byrd had homed in again. But old habits die hard. Within weeks of reuniting, Gene was confronted with the same problems that drove him away. On an autumn 1967 tour, not long after helping the Byrds begin work on what would become the notorious Byrd Brothers album, Clark boarded a plane in Minneapolis, and the familiar dread flooded back. He had another panic attack and couldn't continue. It was as if no time had passed at all. The fact is, Gene could hardly bloody well be a Byrd if he was scared to death of flying. After only about 3 weeks back in the fold, he left the band for the second and final time. There would be no more homecomings, at least for a long while. Gene Clark was on his own again. By 1968, in the wreckage of his Byrds reunion attempt, Gene decided to try a different approach. Rather than going completely solo, he teamed up with others who shared his musical roots. He found a perfect partner in Doug Dillard, a rambunctious banjo virtuoso, fresh out of the bluegrass group The Dillards. Along with guitarist Bernie Leadon, a future Eagle, just to complicate the whole Byrd thing, and a couple other pickers, they formed the group Dillard and Clark and set about pioneering what was essentially country rock before the term even existed. Their debut, The Fantastic Expedition of Dillard and Clark, was a rustic blend of acoustic guitars, fiddles, and Clark's warm voice delivering some of the loveliest songs of his career. Tracks like Train Leaves Here This Morning showcased Gene's effortless marriage of folk melody and country storytelling, and indeed that song would later be covered by the Eagles, which would earn Gene some belated royalties down the line. Critics admired Dillard and Clark, and in later decades, musicians would hail the project as seminal in the development of Americana music. But in the late 60s, the albums didn't sell. It was a sound without a commercial niche yet. More immediately troubling was Gene's own behaviour. Free from the stricter confines of the Byrds, he began indulging in the rock and roll lifestyle like there was no tomorrow, and it started to interfere with his work. When Dillard and Clark played their first shows at LA's Troubadour Club, the same venue where Gene had once harmonised Beatles tunes as a hungry nobody, fans and industry folks packed the room to see the new supergroup. But Gene stumbled onto stage too drunk to perform competently, slurring lyrics and missing cues. The brilliant album they had made was not translating live. Embarrassed and frustrated, Doug Dillard soon bailed out. By early 1969, Dillard and Clark effectively fell apart on stage, another promising venture torpedoed by Gene's personal demons. It became a pattern. Each time Gene rallied himself to create something brilliant, circumstances or self-sabotage knocked him back down. He carried on through the end of the 60s with a second Dillard and Clark album, Through the Morning, Through the Night, which veered more into traditional bluegrass and cover songs, a direction neither Clark nor the critics were fond of. By 1970, as the hippie era closed, Gene Clark was a 25-year-old twice ex-Byrd, ex-folk star, ex-country rock pioneer, wondering what exactly to do next. The music business had, in his view, burned him enough times, so Gene retreated. He married a woman named Carly McCummings, a former go-go dancer he'd been dating in June 1970, and the couple moved to a small house in the coastal hamlet of Albion, California. Tucked away amid the foggy redwoods of Mendocino County, far from the industry pressure cooker, Gene tried to live a simpler life. Over the next couple of years, he and Carly had two sons, Kelly and Kai, and Clark genuinely relished being a father. In later years, a fan who met him in the mid-80s recalled Gene proudly talking about his two sons with a warmth and affection that only a father could muster. That love was real. For a while, Clark seemed content in semi-retirement, fishing, raising his boys, and writing songs on his acoustic guitar while gazing at the Pacific Ocean through his living room window. He even lived off the residual checks from past glories, Byrds royalties and a surprise windfall when the Turtles had a hit covering a Byrds-era Clark tune called You Showed Me. But the urge to create never left him. By 1971, Gene had stockpiled a batch of new songs and headed down to Los Angeles to record a comeback album. The result, titled simply White Light, was a masterpiece of introspective folk rock. Produced by Jesse Ed Davis, a Native American guitarist with whom Gene bonded over shared indigenous ancestry, the album had a mellow, almost spiritual quality. Songs like The Virgin and With Tomorrow were deeply personal and poetic, reflecting Clark's inner search for meaning after the roller coaster of the 60s. Bob Dylan himself praised Gene's song Spanish Guitar from this record as a song he'd wished he'd written. Critics lauded White Light as an artistically brilliant work. But once again, Clark's old habits undermined his prospects. The album got almost no promotion, partly because Gene refused to tour to support it. Whether it was lingering stage fright, anxiety, or simply preferring to stay in Albion with his family, Gene wouldn't get out on the road to win over audiences. White Light faded into cult obscurity, another critically acclaimed Gene Clark record that few heard at the time. If Gene was disappointed, he kept soldiering on. In 1972, he recorded some ambitious new tracks meant for a follow-up album. This is where fate dealt him one of its crueler hands. Clark had laid down several excellent songs, including the lush Full Circle song and Silver Raven, and was feeling optimistic, even relatively sober and healthy for once. But while Gene was briefly out of town during the sessions, a bizarre studio calamity occurred. The producer in charge invited Sly Stone, the notorious funk star, to drop by the studio, hoping maybe for a cool cameo or just to impress Sly. What followed was rock and roll mayhem. Sly Stone rolled in with an entourage of 40 people and a truck full of turning Gene's recording session into a multi-day party. In a matter of days, Sly's crew maxed out the record company's budget, ordering thousands of dollars of champagne and gourmet food on the studio's tab. By the time Gene returned, the money for his album was simply gone, vaporized in a binge of excess he hadn't even been around to enjoy. The project was halted and those tracks wound up shelved, eventually sneaking out only in the Netherlands as an album called Roadmaster. For Gene, it was a near-comical stroke of bad luck. Who else's album gets torpedoed by someone else's wild cocaine party? He could only shake his head and move on. Trying to find a bit of stability, Clarke next turned to the most familiar well he had, the Byrds. Capitalizing on the nostalgia beginning to creep in for the 60s, Gene and the other original Byrds, McGuinn, Crosby, Chris Hillman and Michael Clarke, reunited in late 1972. The idea was to record a one-off reunion album, simply titled Byrds, released in 1973. Expectations were high. Each member had gone on to other notable successes, especially Crosby with Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, and fans' hope for magic. Gene contributed several strong songs, including the beautiful Full Circle, aptly named for his return, that opens the album. But alas, it was the same old story all over again. The Byrds reunion record got mixed reviews, with many feeling the chemistry just wasn't the same, and complaining that Crosby, who produced it, had done a lackluster job. It sold modestly, but not at the blockbuster level Asylum Records had hoped for. Disheartened by the critical drubbing and fed up with clashing egos, the five Byrds promptly disbanded again after a few desultory sessions and no tour. Convinced there was no future in a reunion, they walked away and Gene was back to square one. 1974 found Gene Clarke at a crossroads. Personally, his marriage was straining under his renewed rock and roll lifestyle. He had moved back to Los Angeles without his family to chase the next record deal, leaving Carly and the kids up in Albion. Isolated from the grounding influence of home, Gene slid back into old habits, long nights at the Rainbow Bar, bottles of Jack Daniels, and the temptations of LA's party scene. Unsurprisingly, Carly had had enough. After years of weathering Gene's ups and downs, she filed for divorce in 1974, taking their two young sons with her. Clarke was heartbroken and now truly on his own. In response to this turmoil, he did what he always did, threw himself into music. That year, David Geffen's Asylum Records, home to the era's premier singer-songwriters like Joni Mitchell and Jackson Browne, offered Gene an album deal. Finally, here was a chance for a fresh start with a hot label. Clarke poured every ounce of his creativity and emotion into what would become no other, recorded in 1974. The sessions were anything but modest. Gene had a $100,000 budget and a cast of top-flight session players at his disposal. Under producer Thomas Jefferson Kay, he crafted expansive, genre-blending tracks that fused rock, country, gospel, even choral music. The songs were dense and dreamlike, full of Gene's searching, mystical lyrics. In the haunting track, Some Misunderstanding, and the title song No Other, he sounded like a man communing with the cosmos, trying to make sense of the wreckage of his life and loves. When Geffen got the finished album, however, the mogul was not pleased. The record had only 8 songs, none of them obvious singles, and its genre-defying style confused Asylum's marketing team. Geffen infamously blew up at Gene and his producer in a meeting, yelling, "Make a proper fucking album," as if Clarke hadn't just bared his soul across those 8 epic tracks. But Geffen wanted candy, not gourmet meals. The label then all but sabotaged the release. Geffen slashed the promotional budget, practically burying No Other upon arrival. Unsurprisingly, the album flopped on the charts, peaking at a dismal number 144. Gene Clarke's grand statement was dismissed as an indulgent oddity, its brilliance recognised only by a cult few. Much later, critics would rehabilitate No Other as a lost masterpiece. But in 1974, that idea would have meant little to Gene beyond cold comfort. And it's true, if you haven't heard it, it probably is his finest and most complex work. Well worth a listen if you ask me. The failure of No Other devastated Gene. This was supposed to be his triumphant comeback, Instead, it felt like fate had cut him down yet again. Clark was now divorced, effectively dropped by his label, and emotionally exhausted. One of the songs on No Other was tellingly titled Life's Greatest Fool, and Clark couldn't shake the sense that perhaps it was autobiographical. He did not stop working, but a certain desperation crept in. In 1975 to 76, Gene kept writing and even hinted to the press about new cosmic songs fusing country with R&B and funk. The result, after some demoing, was another album's worth of material that finally found a home at RSO Records. His 1977 release bore the title Two Sides to Every Story, a nod both to the messy breakup with his wife and perhaps to Gene's own divided soul. The album's songs drip with the ache of broken hearts and personal ruin tracks like Sister Moon, Lonely Saturday, and Past Addresses. These are barely veiled laments for his failed marriage and the loneliness that followed. On the cover, Gene appears as a bearded, prematurely weathered cowboy in front of a farmhouse, looking every bit the melancholy, broken figure he felt like inside. Critics noted the raw pain in his voice on those ballads. One of his brothers later said, Gene's lyrics always came directly from personal experience. And you can hear that truth in the grooves of Two Sides. Unfortunately, despite its soulful authenticity, this record met a by now familiar fate. Minimal chart impact and an American audience that barely noticed. By the late 1970s, Gene Clark was clinging to the fringes of the music business. He had become an underground figure, admired by fellow musicians and die-hard fans, but largely unknown to the mainstream. In a twist of fate, however, 1979 brought a glimmer of spotlight back to Gene's life. That year, he reunited with two old Byrds mates, Roger McGuinn and Chris Hillman, to form a trio billed as McGuinn, Clark and Hillman. Record execs hoped this Byrds supergroup might capture some attention. Remarkably, their self-titled album in 1979 did chart in the US Top 40 and even went gold. But there was a catch. The slick late 70s production veered into soft rock and even mild disco influences, a style far from Gene's comfort zone. Though Gene wrote 4 songs for the album, including Backstage Pass, a tart commentary on the boredom of touring, and Release Me Girl, a surprisingly disco-tinged experiment, the project didn't truly rejuvenate him. On the surface, he was back on big stages with his old comrades, playing sizable venues and even scoring a minor hit single. But behind the scenes, Gene's old troubles resurfaced yet again. He found himself butting heads with the producers, unhappy with the musical direction. Worse, his reliability waned as he began dabbling in heroin, a new low for a man who previously only struggled with alcohol. During sessions for a second McGuinn, Clark and Hillman album in 1980, Gene was often MIA or incapacitated. Fed up, McGuinn and Hillman finished the album without him, releasing it under their own names, with Gene demoted to a featuring credit on a couple of tracks. By 1981, Gene Clark was out of the band, his last shot at a high-profile act, squandered in a haze of drug use and creative disagreements. At this point, even Clark realized he was spiraling. In 1982, he made a serious attempt to get clean. Gene and his old friend Jesse Ed Davis, who had his own substance demons, moved to Hawaii for several months to dry out and get healthy away from the LA temptations. The tropical exile did help temporarily. Clean and rejuvenated, Clark returned to Los Angeles and formed a new backing band named the Firebirds. By 1984, he released an independent album also called Firebird, just as a new generation of jangly guitar bands, R.E.M., Tom Petty, the Long Riders, were explicitly citing the Byrds as a major influence. Suddenly, Gene found himself embraced as an elder statesman by the so-called Paisley underground scene in LA. He'd appear as a surprise guest at small club gigs with bands half his age, who treated him with reverence. In 1986, he teamed up with one of those younger admirers, roots rock singer Carla Olson, for a duet album called So Rebellious a Lover. To everyone's surprise, this austere collection of country-tinged songs became Gene's best-selling solo album ever. He finally won both praise in the press and decent sales on the growing Americana circuit. At 41, Gene Clark seemed to finally find a measure of stability. He had a modest but real comeback as a respected country rock troubadour, far from the hit parade but at least earning a living doing what he loved. Yet even in these moments of redemption, chaos was never far from Gene's orbit. In 1985, he instigated a controversy with his former Byrds bandmates that turned ugly. It started innocently. The 20th anniversary of the Byrds' debut was approaching, and Gene proposed a reunion tour. McGuinn, Crosby, and Hillman weren't interested. Water under the bridge, they thought. Feeling spurned but still craving that legacy, Gene took matters into his own hands. He assembled a group of friends and former collaborators, including ex-Byrds, Michael Clarke and John York, and began touring under the rather unwieldy banner Gene Clark and the 20th anniversary tribute to the Byrds. Promoters, smelling profit, soon shortened the billings simply to the Byrds, implying this was the Byrds reborn, even though it was basically Gene and some sidemen playing Byrds songs. When McGuinn, Crosby and Hillman caught wind, they were furious. Legal threats flew. At one point, the trio even mounted their own competing tour. The whole fiasco damaged friendships permanently. Clark eventually backed off, disbanding his ersatz Byrds group to avoid a lawsuit, but the bitterness lingered. For Gene, who always felt he never got proper credit, the episode was perhaps an ill-advised attempt to grasp some legacy and income. Instead, it just alienated his old bandmates further. By the late 1980s, Gene's health was declining precipitously. Decades of hard living had ravaged his body. He suffered from severe ulcers, likely a result of chronic alcohol abuse and stress, and in 1988, he underwent surgery to remove a malignant ulcer that was bleeding internally. Amazingly, after that scare, he managed a period of sobriety. Friends and family hoped he'd finally turned a corner. Fate gave him one more lucky break to build on. In 1989, Tom Petty included a cover of I'll Feel a Whole Lot Better on his blockbuster album, Full Moon Fever. The album sold millions, and Gene suddenly received a windfall of royalty money unlike any he'd seen in years. Flush with cash and no immediate obligations, Clark sadly fell into what one friend called a holiday from reality. He relapsed hard, going on a prolonged binge. He skipped concert dates, ignored new opportunities, essentially sabotaging the very comeback that the Petty cover could have fueled. Worse, this self-destructive spree cost him the one steady presence in his turbulent life, Terry Messina, who had known Gene since the 60s and repeatedly come back to help him. Terry Messina's role in Gene Clark's life was equal parts lover, caregiver, and guardian angel. They'd first had that fling in 1966, but Terry showed up again in Gene's life in the mid-70s after his divorce and became a recurring on and off companion for well over a decade. She was a woman with a sharp mind who loved a good time, and she also had a nurturing side. This was good for Gene, but the vortex of hardcore drug use was pulling both of them down. In late 1977, when Gene embarked on a solo tour and some duo shows with McGuinn, Terry came along and helped keep Gene sober and organised enough to perform. She even took charge of his much-neglected finances at one point, discovering Gene hadn't paid his taxes in 4 years and sorting out an arrangement with the IRS. Terry effectively gave Gene a second chance at life multiple times, getting him to lose weight, shave and smarten up during the late 70s when he looked dangerously unhealthy. She opened her home in Laurel Canyon to him whenever he was struggling. However, as much as Terry loved Gene, she eventually realised she couldn't save him from himself. By the late 80s, as Gene once more sank into an alcoholic fog despite his ulcer surgery, Terry reached her breaking point. His late 80s relapse, fueled by that Tom Petty royalty money, was the last straw. Terry Messina left Gene for good, ending their 2-decade on-and-off saga in heartbreak. According to friends, she just couldn't watch him destroy himself any longer. In January 1991, something happened that momentarily lifted Gene's spirits. The Byrds, the real ones, set aside past grievances to reunite for their Hall of Fame induction in New York. Gene travelled to their ceremony, nervously facing McGuinn, Crosby, and Hillman after years of estrangement. Miraculously, the old chemistry sparked for one night. They joked together, hugged, and when they performed, Gene beamed as he led them through "I'll Feel a Whole Lot Better," the same song Tom Petty had recently revived. They then played Mr. Tambourine Man and Turn, Turn, Turn. It was a brief vindication, an acknowledgement that Gene Clark's contributions to music mattered and would be remembered. It would also be the last time the classic Byrds lineup would perform together. Sadly, even this happy epilogue carried a dark undertone. Around the same time, Gene had been diagnosed with throat cancer, likely the cumulative result of heavy smoking and drinking, and his doctors had also warned him that his heart was weakened by years of abuse. Clark kept these issues mostly private, but those close to him saw that he looked frail. Back home in Los Angeles in spring of 1991, Gene tried to stay active, talking about new songwriting projects, but his body was failing. On May 24, 1991, Gene Clark's long, painful decline came to an end. He died in his sleep at age 46, officially of natural causes, specifically a bleeding ulcer that caused internal bleeding and heart failure. The coroner made clear that Gene's decades of drug and alcohol addiction had directly contributed to his untimely death. It was a quiet exit for a man who once stood at the center of rock's loudest roar. His family buried him in his tiny hometown of Tipton, Missouri, where his gravestone is poignantly inscribed with the title of the album he considered his finest work, No Other. Gene Clark passed away, feeling, as one friend said, that he hadn't achieved success. He had often compared himself bitterly to peers like Neil Young, or even his old bandmates, wondering why their stars shone brighter while his flickered. But history can be ironic. In the years since his death, Gene's influence and legacy have grown enormously. He is now rightly credited as a visionary of folk rock, country rock, and psychedelia, all at once, a rare triple crown. Either you love Gene Clark, or you haven't heard him, goes a saying among aficionados. Perhaps the deepest validation came in the form of a documentary about his life, aptly titled The Bird Who Flew Alone, The Triumphs and Tragedy of Gene Clark. Indeed, Gene never quite got the public recognition that contemporaries like Graham Parsons did, but the scales are slowly balancing. In the end, Gene Clark's legacy is that of a brilliant, tormented trailblazer. He lived the archetypal rock and roll story in Fast Forward. The meteoric rise with the Byrds, the dramatic exit, the spiral through substance abuse and obscurity, flashes of redemption, and a tragic early demise. Listen to Gene's voice on a track like Silver Raven or Kathleen, and you hear a man bearing his soul, unguarded and true. If some of his music feels drenched in sorrow, it's because Gene really lived those sorrows. And remarkably, he transformed them into art that ensures The Bird Who Flew Alone will never be forgotten. That's about all for this one. Let me know if you have a favourite Gene Clark record down in the comments, and have a chat down there. As you know, I like to read and respond to you all. And I'll say this much, if you ever have the luxury of listening to No Other on vinyl with a decent hi-fi setup and some earphones, you can hear what a marvellous and complex record it is. Absolutely magnificent. A great way to spend a morning. Take it from me. Be sure to subscribe, like, share, and all that nonsense. I've been Chester. See you next week. Cheers.